Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank y'all very much for inviting me. I appreciate y'all inviting me. And I thought we just talk a little bit before we get started. Our subject is going to be on how do the Christians come to adopt Sunday? Let's start with just asking a simple question, and that is, who are we? And I know that, we are the Hebrew roots people, but we are the Father's people. Okay, we're the Father's people. And how do we get recognized? And we get recognized by the sign between him and us, which is the Sabbath. And it's really multiple Sabbaths, right? So that's the sign between us and the Father. So if people are going to recognize his people, there's a sign to be able to tell, and that is the Sabbath. And it's not just the Sabbath, it's also the holy days together. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what has happened in the past and how people kept the Sabbath in the past. Okay. So, God's people are wonderful people, and the Father's using us to build a new kingdom. And so this kingdom that we're in right now is going to go down, and then we're going to build a brand new kingdom that's going to rise from what we see going on here. And what's interesting, when the Messiah returns, the people will already be in the wilderness, and they'll be trying to serve God the best that they can. So that is when the new kingdom gets established, is when this one gets taken down. So I just want to read this verse here. Isaiah 6, verse 13. Though there be a tenth that remain in it, it will burn again, and there will be an oak which the stump remains where it has fallen. The holy seed is the stump. So we are going to be this whole tree of Babylon gets cut down, and there's a stump left, and we are going to be that stump. And he tells you, you are the holy seed. So everything will grow just like a regular stump. Everything grows from the stump. Okay. Now, I'm going to start on the Sabbath piece, and we're going to go through the basic history. We'll start all the way back to the time of the Messiah and what actually happened. So after the Messiah died, then we know that the people that at that point went into an area we call Pella, which was a town just outside. They had many miracles that happened during that time, and they used those miracles, and you were convinced that the miracles were telling them that it was time to leave out and go. So they had like 6 different miracles. One of them, y'all heard of these miracles. The door to the temple would come open on its own. And then you had the other miracle where the string that they used for atonement became red, and it would never turn back white. So they saw all these miracles happen, and they said it's time for us to leave out and go somewhere else. And they basically went. I guess all of you can see this screen, right? The ones on the Zoom call, y'all can see my screen, right? They basically went to this area we called Antioch, Rome, and Alexander. And so the Romans were pagan worshipers. That means they basically served Mithra, which was the sun god. Okay, but then they had 3 other groups of people there. They would eventually have the Catholic Church there, which would be established. Then they are going to have the Aryan people, which are the people that are evacuating from the east, come in that area. And so Rome basically was Sunday keepers from the very beginning. Y'all understand that, because that's who they were. So we're going to talk about how did they get from just keeping the Sabbath to where we are today. So I'm going to start with Josephus. And Josephus wrote this: there's no cities, whether Greek or barbarian, that do not have the custom of resting on the Sabbath. So at his time, he lived at the time of the Messiah. At his time, He said everybody was keeping the Saturday Sabbath. Everybody was keeping it. So it's really interesting. How did we get from that place to where we are today, where everybody is keeping Sunday? And that's what we're going to cover here. So for 200 years, most people don't realize it, but the Roman Catholic Church kept the Sabbath instead of Sunday for 200 years. You know, what transpired was really the fact that that you had some things going on in history. Okay, you had the Scythians which were in the area of the Ukraine, which is our ancestors for most of us. You probably don't realize it, but most of the people that were your ancestors, if you came from Europe, lived in the area of the Ukraine for 600 years. And so they would be pushed out by a tribe called the Sarmatians, and they pushed them forward into Europe, which meant they had to go into the Roman Empire. And they had already been educated by the apostles, because remember, the apostles were told, the Messiah said, I want you to go to the 10 tribes or the 12 tribes of Israel. Remember that? So that's where they went. And Andrew went into that area that we see right, that we're talking about here, which was in the area of Greece all the way up to into the area of the Ukraine. That was the area he covered. Really interesting, because the Scottish people still keep St. Andrews to this day. And the reason they keep St. Andrews is they say, we don't know why we keep it, because St. Andrews never came to Scotland. Well, because when they fled out, and they don't even know their history, when they fled out of that area of the Ukraine, many of them went into Scotland. So they kept it because they honored Andrew, they call him Saint Andrew, right? But it was Andrew, one of the original 12 apostles. And it's really funny, because I saw somebody online and they were talking about how, well, we keep St. Andrews, but we don't know why. And so it's something they do, because that was who originally taught them was Andrew. And then Thomas went from that area clear over to Parthia and into India. So he taught that area. And then Paul, he did both Gentile nations and Israelite nations. And then Peter spent a lot of time in England, and then he went back to Rome, but he wasn't the first bishop in charge. Most people don't realize that. The first bishop was Linus. Linus was the very first bishop of Rome, and he had an interesting history. He came from the Trojan kings out of England. They brought him in as a prisoner because he was from the royal line of the English people, and they were going to execute him. But he gave this great speech, and the people were so impressed that said, we're not going to kill him. We're just going to put him under house arrest. Well, he would be the one that starts the church in Rome. So you see that all of these people were keeping the Sabbath and the holy days all of this time up until about almost the 2nd century. Then that's when it began to change. So at the same time, when the Messiah passed away, we think he passed away around 30 AD, and Philo was probably knew the Messiah at his time, and he moved from Jerusalem. He was one of the wealthiest people in Jerusalem, and he started a school in Alexander, Egypt. Okay, and interesting, because that's where the paganism came in. They mixed the Jewish traditions with the Greek traditions, and they made their own form of a pagan religion. Well, this is where a lot of our teachings have come from, is the Philo school. So I'm going to read this to you. This is Encyclopedia Britannica. Jews were certainly called upon to compromise with their traditions it may assume that Philo was a product of such education. It mentions a wide range of Greek writings. Okay, so they were developing this school. They were developing this school in Egypt, and that's where all the teachers from Rome began to get educated. And so then we have this situation where Philo was teaching the people, but he did mainly the oral traditions and a lot of Greek philosophy into his teachings. Now, this man right here, do you see Justin Martyr? He is the sole reason why people keep Sunday today, because he's the one that pushed it. He wrote documents, and he taught all the people that to start keeping Sunday. Is very interesting. And this all came out of this Philo school. So Justin introduced the concept of Sunday worship to the people, and that caught on. And they would boast that they would not, that they would mix Christianity with the pagan beliefs. They thought that was good. Now, this is the actual event right here. Pope Victor, which was the bishop in Rome, they didn't have popes quite at that point. He, with Clement, who was head of the Alexander School in 190 AD, were the ones to make Sunday the prominent day of worship in the Catholic Church. So this happened in 190 AD. So you see that these people were keeping the Sabbath up until this point, and this is when it changed over, and this is where it changed over under this man called Victor I, who was the Bishop of Rome. Well, they first changed Passover, and then it was how they sold it to the people. That was how the people were already being educated into that system. I don't really know how they did it. Now, Polycarp, so in 155, now Polycarp was the apostle under John. John was the very last apostle to be alive. He passed away somewhere around 100 BC or so. And so what happened basically is that he was in a discussion with the Roman bishop who was named Anicetus, that he wanted to keep Sunday as Passover. Okay, so he just wanted a certain date. They wanted to count from the full moon and keep Sunday as Passover. Now, when the encyclopedias write this, they keep calling it Easter, but they were really keeping Passover at that time. But all they did was change the date. So they said, we think it needs to be on the day that the Messiah was resurrected, and they thought that was on Sunday. So, so this is why Polycarp went to him and tried to explain him and convince him otherwise, but he would not listen. And so this is where Easter got started. Easter got started, and this was called the Quantispian controversy. That quanto means 4, and despian means 10, so that's 14. It's the controversy of the 14. And so they weren't able to convince each other to make any changes. So that's how Passover got changed to Easter. And so you see that all of this is happening at a fairly early age in Rome. Okay, the two men could not agree on the celebration, and the encyclopedia keeps calling it Easter, but it was really Passover. Now, this is proof right here. I'm going to read some of this. This is written by Polycrates, and he was saying that, look, he said, all of my family, everybody in my family were bishops. I'm the 8th one. And he says, they've all kept the 14th day of the Passover. So I'm showing y'all that as proof to show that you see that the apostles and the apostles after them were still believing in the 14th day of Passover. So I'm showing you the history. So there's no mistake that, well, we're not sure if they really kept Passover or not. No, they really kept it. And this is our proof right here. where Polycrates is talking about this, and he says, everybody in my family has kept the 14th day for Passover. So in other words, you can't go back and say, well, it had to be, could have been Easter they were keeping back then. No, this man is he's locking this down, that we've always done it this way and for all these generations. And then he's talking about how he was a bishop and he's the eighth one. And so, I could read you the whole quote here, but I can also send this to you so you can read some of this yourself. So at this point, now you have things that are going to get a little complicated, because now you've got the Roman Catholic Church established in Rome. And now you have the 2nd century is when Parthia falls. Parthia is where most of our relatives lived. I'm talking about if you were European descendants, that's where most of your relatives came from, is the area of Parthia and Scythia, which were in the east. And when it fell, they got pushed by the Persians into the Roman Empire. Then you had Scythia being purged at the same time. They're being pushed into the Roman Empire. And so when this happens, now these people have already been educated by people like Andrew and Thomas, and they actually have their own Bible. So in Antioch in the 1st century, there was a man named Lucian, and they persecuted him so bad they put him in prison and they starved him to death. But he's the one that wrote our first Bible. Our first Bible was written by a man named Lucian in the very 1st century, around 112 or somewhere in there. And that is the Bible that these people who were the Germanic tribes had. They had that Bible, and it was called the Atala. And that was the Bible that would go into Europe and be used. And then in the 4th century, you had a different Bible being written by Jerome. Jerome wrote the Catholic Bible, but everybody doesn't know about this Bible, the Atala. But that's the Bible that would originally become our Bible that we have now. They took all these manuscripts and began to put them together. Now, at the same time, some of the other translations of the Bible that were actually earlier. All right, so Jerome had created the Catholic Bible, but the people in Alexander were writing their own Bibles. And so you have the Sinaiticus and many of the other early Bibles that they use to translate with today, like some of the modern Bibles, they go back to those Bibles that came out of Alexander. So that you understand that the Bible that came through was called the received text, and it went into Europe, and it would eventually, now what they did is they kept it under lock and key. And then the reason they kept it under lock and key is they didn't want people copying it, because then you have copies that are not always correct. So they did that, and the Father made sure they did that for us so that we would have Bibles now. Because, there was one of the early teachers that got put in jail because he snuck in, copied the book of Psalms, and then after he copied the book of Psalms, they caught him, and so they put him in jail and exiled him from the country, because it was something they couldn't do, because once you start making copies of things, then they become inaccurate. So they wanted to have one book. And this would go on until they have the printing press that happened around 1000. Then once they had that in place, then they began to produce, the Bibles that we have now. But at that point, nobody had their own Bible. Mm-hmm. So now you have 3 groups of people going into Rome. You have the original people that we would call the pagans. I hate to use the word pagans, but they were the ones keeping Mithka. They were truly worshiping the sun. You had the Romans who had their own separate religion, which were now they're keeping Sunday. And then you have the other group coming in, which are these people right here, the Germanic tribes that have been trained by Andrew and many of the others. They're coming in keeping the Saturday Sabbath, keeping the holy days, having their own Bible. So you see, now you've got three groups of people. Now you come to the point where this is going to come to a clash. And so that's when you start seeing the persecution in the Roman Empire. It was most serious under Diocletian. Diocletian was the emperor that did the greatest persecution against the Christians. But there was another man named Gathius who also was persecuting the Christians. He had Rome was split in more than one. They would have like co-rulers, and Gathius was one of them. Gathius was really interesting because he would be the one that would come out with a declaration that says anybody can keep any religion they want in Rome. Okay, and the reason he did that is because there was a plague placed on him when he was killing the Christians. There was a plague placed on him by the Father, and he eventually died of that plague. And he realized that he got the plague because he was killing the Christians. So that's why he put that decree in. Well, right behind him comes in Constantine. And y'all are all familiar with Constantine because everybody falsely accuses him of all these stuff, changing everything over. But it was done two centuries before that. They were already keeping Sunday in Rome. But now keep in mind, everybody else is keeping Saturday everywhere else. It's only changed in Rome. It didn't change in Alexandria. Everybody's still keeping the Saturday Sabbath. So this is where it gets really interesting. The people that were the Germanic tribes that were keeping the true holy days and the true Sabbath that had come in out of the East, they were called the Arian Christians, named after a man named Arius. They entered the Roman Empire and they considered them heretics. Now look at what the Father did, because the Father said, well, he wanted to separate them from the people. So the Romans passed laws saying that you cannot marry a heretic. So if you are of the Mythka religion, you cannot marry someone that is coming in from the Germanic tribes. So they're bringing them in because they are mercenaries. They wanted them to fight in their wars. So they hired them and brought them in. And that's when we get to this next story of the Visigoths. There was a man who was a slave, and his name was Euphallus. Do y'all see his name right here? And he came in as a slave, and he created the biggest revival that Rome had ever seen. And everybody was beginning to now start looking to Christianity, and I'm talking about the real Christianity. And that is really interesting because these are some of the tribes: the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals were Christianized while they were still outside the bounds of the empire. So a lot of people thought, well, they got Christianized when they came into Roman Empire. No, they were already, like we talked about before, they were already Christians when they came in. So this was called Arianism. And y'all all know about the Council of Nicaea and that what they had tried to push. Well, Euphallus, this is such an interesting story because he actually turned over, because the king that came in after Constantine was Constantius, and he convinced him to become an Arian. So he was now keeping Christmas. He's keeping the Sabbath and the holy days, and along with the Pope. Okay, so now you have the Pope. Do I have him down here somewhere? Yes, I think it does. Do y'all see where it says Pope Felix? Can y'all see him down here on the screen? He was called the non-Pope. They changed the Pope. The Pope left the Catholic Church and become an Arian Christian. So you had this huge revival going on. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine living at that time and seeing all of these? The king becomes an Arian, the Pope becomes an Arian. And this is all after the time of Constantine. So interesting because, Aphalus was just a simple man. He was just a simple man. He came in as a slave, but you see how the Father can use people to change things. And the Father loves to choose humble people to do a work for him. That's what he likes. So in 1410, Rome has already now begun to disintegrate, and she goes under. She gets sacked by a man named Alaric, and you can see his name up here on the screen. Alaric, they called him Moses. And I have to tell you this story. This is a wonderful story. So when these people came into the empire, they put them in, because they considered them heretics, they put them in like ghetto areas. They'll section them off, but they didn't have a lot of food, and they weren't giving them enough supplies, and so many of them was starving, and they didn't have weapons. They took their weapons away from them. All of this, these people were really struggling, and that really caused a huge repentance among the Aryan people also. But interesting is that this man named Alaric, he went and formed got them all together and formed a military, and they went to the first town and they fought these people without weapons and won. The city was called Arianople. And can you imagine fighting a war against people and you don't have weapons and they do? I mean, that's just, to me, that's an amazing thing. It's just an amazing thing for these people. That's your ancestors. That's the people that that were your ancestors. That's what they did. I just think it's so fascinating, to see what they did. Then after they won the first one, they went in and sacked it. They took all the weapons, and then just one town after another started falling to these people. So that would bring them in 410, and they surrounded the city of Rome and took it down in 410. Now, the reason that's so significant is these people that came in from a place called Parthia, which is like in the area of Asia Minor. And they had fought Rome 13 times, and Rome never defeated them one time. It was the Parthians, and they fought them 13 times. So this has been going on for centuries. Now, for the first time, the Father allowed them to take down Rome. Just how amazing. See, we don't know that history because they don't teach it to us. But for all those centuries, they had been fighting Rome, and now they have taken over Rome. And the whole western part of Europe now, you have all this exit of people coming from the east. It was called the Great Wandering, and they moved themselves into the western part of Europe. And so now the Romans have to move out of that area. They only had 29,000 Romans left in that area, but they began to migrate, because that's what happens with war. You migrate out. You understand? So they migrated out, and they left that whole area, which was called Gaul then, to these Germanic tribes, which are your people, your ancestors. Okay. And so they moved into what place? So anybody know? Constantinople, which is Istanbul today, right? That began the what we call the Eastern Byzantine Empire. They compared, they wanted to, all the time, these people were talking to Alaric, and they were comparing him to Moses. They called him Moses, because to them, he was like Moses. So, basically pushed all the Romans out to the Byzantine Empire. All right. Now, this is when things get interesting, and nobody knows this this information either. This is amazing information. The Pope at that time, let's see if I can get his name up on the screen. Here he is, Sylvester. He lived around the 1335. He wanted to stop the Saturday worship because, see, all the Aryans and the Germanic tribes, they were keeping, like we talked about, they were keeping Saturday, and they were keeping, the holy days. And so he wanted to stop that. So he issued something called Elvira. And and in that it says that you have to keep both days. You have to keep Sunday and Saturday. So now they're trying to make this change with the people. So they said, you got to keep Saturday and Sunday, but Saturday you need to fast on that day. So what happened is then Pope Innocent came back and he made tightened it up and made another decree saying there's no exceptions to that. So for over 600 years, 600, 700 years, this is what the people did. They would fast on Saturday and they would keep Sunday too. So that's how we got our weekends. That's why you get off on Saturday and Sunday today, is because these people were pushing this in. Totally different history in England. If I came and told you how they did it in England, you'd know that's amazing stuff. But this is what they were doing. And I'm going to show you proof right here. So you had Socrates and you had Sosimon, and both of these people, in other words, let me read the whole thing. Though most all churches through the world celebrated the mysteries of the Sabbath every week, yet the Christians in Alexander and Rome, on the account of the ancient traditions, ceased to do this. So he's writing in 450. Y'all see he's writing in 450. So he's telling you everybody's still keeping the Saturday Sabbath at that point. Everybody's still keeping it, but except for Rome and Alexander. Do y'all see what he's saying? So then here's another quote. This is Sosimon. The people of Constantinople and most of everybody assembled together on the Sabbath as well as the first day of the week, which was the custom that never got observed in Alexander. So this is where they started doing the fasting on the Sabbath, and then on Sunday they went to church too. So they had 2 days that they went to church. So what they're trying to do is to discourage them from keeping Saturday by making them fast on it. Do y'all see what they're trying to do? Now, yeah, yes. So, all right, so Sadius said unto Theodoric, all right, so it is a fact that it was formerly a custom in the East to keep the Sabbath in the same manner as the Lord's Day and hold sacred assemblies, while on the other hand, the people of the West continued with the Lord's Day, were neglecting the celebration of the Sabbath. Now I'm going to get to some interesting stuff. So you know from the book of Revelations that there were 7 churches. And you know that they were located in the area of Asia Minor, just around up to the part of where Greece was. Okay. Now, those churches is what we're talking about right here. Those churches would keep the Sabbath, and they had their own pope. And they were called the Old Assyrian Church. It was the churches and they allowed them to stay in the Persian Empire. The Persians didn't have a problem with their worship, as long as they would give people to help them with the wars from time to time. They were fine. They allowed them to have freedom of religion. So these people that were in the East, they had their own pope, and there was the people in the West had their own pope. The people in the West were the ones that were keeping Saturday and fasting on it, and Sunday they weren't. They were going to church. Well, the people in the East weren't doing that. So now we get to this story of Theodosius. Now we're starting to have a persecution. I'm almost done too, by the way. It's not going to be much longer. So Theodorus told him he was trying to stomp out the Sabbath, the holy days, the Arian religion. So he was trying to stomp it out. And so he confiscated all the churches in 380 AD. In other words, he shut them all down. And so now the people are going to start fleeing out of the western part, at least the believers, and they're going to try and go into the east where these other churches are. Do y'all see why? Because now they're going to have freedom of religion there. Now, it says all churches were confiscated and were banned. We ordered that all of those who followed the law to assume the name of the Catholic Church, they're going to push in the Catholic Church, and consider all others as demeaned and insane. We ordered that they bear the infamy of heresy. So they're now beginning to persecute the people that are in the Roman Empire, and if they are Christians and believers. Okay, so now you see this going on. Now watch what the Father does. This is under Theodosius, who is the Roman emperor. Watch what the Father does. You're just going to be amazed. Now, he also made Christmas and Easter the government holidays. He was also responsible. I'm going to skip over the Clovis part, because Clovis comes in and he marries a Catholic queen, and he changes everything in Spain to Catholic Church. So I'm going to skip over that part because I want to get to this part. Now, this is when the people began to push themselves into the Alps, into the mountain ranges, because now that's the Waldensians beginning to come to fruition. So there was a emperor in the east who was one of the Gothic kings. He was a Gothic king. He allowed the people to come into his kingdom so that they didn't get persecuted. He was called Theodoric the Great. And so he allowed the people to come in. So you see, there's been plenty of times in history then people had to flee for their own safety. So it's not going to be just us. Now, Justinian comes in and he gives the people an order. He says, you either accept the Catholic Church, or you're going to lose your property, and you're going to now lose your job. You got 3 months. And he did this around 532. And I'm going to show you what the Father does. That's the same time in the Byzantine Empire that the bubonic plague hit, the Black Plague. Do y'all see what the Father did? Now, it didn't touch any of the other people. It didn't touch any of the other people that were in the western part that were still believers. But right there in Constantinople, 10,000 people died every day from the Black Plague. So, was this by accident, or did the Father do this because of what they were doing to the Christians? See, when I read history, I look at it that way. So, now we get to this part that I love. This story is something I love. Let me see if I can get it up on the screen. So Pope Nicholas IV, in the 9th century, our people were still keeping the Saturday Sabbath worldwide, except for in Rome and Alexandria. Everybody's still keeping Saturday. Now, they fasted on it, but they were still keeping. Can you believe that? Did you have any clue? And the Catholic Church was always the smallest and the minority church. But they always had the support of the Roman emperors, because it's just how that worked, right? Now watch this. This is really interesting. So Pope Nicholas I in the 9th century sent a document for the fasting on the Sabbath. So he sent this prince of Bulgaria this document and said, you need to be fasting on the Sabbath. Because remember, the people in the East, in the old Assyrian church, they weren't fasting. They were not fasting. Okay. So the people on the West, they were doing fasting on Saturday and going to church on Sunday. So he sent him a document. The Pope from the West sent him a document and said, I want you to start making your people fast on Saturday. So, and he excommunicated him. Well, now 1050, watch what happens. Here's Pope Leo the Ninth excommunicated Michael Celerius, who was the Pope in the East. Remember, I told you there was two popes. And so the Pope in the East says, you have no authority over me. You have no authority over my people. So you excommunicated me. I'm going to excommunicate you. So what I'm trying to show you is the people are still keeping the Sabbath until the 10th century. And so now you start seeing that people began to become part of that Catholic Church around the 12th century. And then in England, in Britain, and in those areas, that's when it began to change there also. And that starts what? Anybody tell me? The Dark Ages. So when we stopped keeping the Sabbath as a people, we went into the Dark Ages. Now that's such a, is that not amazing history? I just think it's amazing. So around 1335, you have another Black Plague. And that now kills 1/3 of the people in Europe. Do y'all remember the statistics that the Black Plague, that was when the major hit happened around the 13th century. That is when you had a new leader rise up in England, Wycliffe. It was so interesting because he was the one that's saying, we need to stand against the Catholic Church. We need to start going back to the Sabbath and the holy days. We need to start, and that's when the real, true Protestant Reformation started. Although, guess who they gave credit to? Martin Luther in 1554 or something. Okay, so it's the most amazing thing because now you have the people beginning, and by the way, Wycliffe was a Saturday Sabbath keeper. So you see this pattern going on in history where the people began to now start, turning themselves back. So what's causing them to turn back? The plague. The Black Plague is what caused them to turn back because they thought, oh my goodness, it must be the end time. Because they already knew about the end time, right? Because the preachers probably were telling them, these are the things in the book of Revelations. And so they were thinking, oh my goodness, it's the end time. I better straighten myself up. So they began to now start the Protestant Reformation, which, I can come back and teach you more about the Protestant Reformation. But my favorite part is the 30 Years' War, because the 30 Years' War is when all of these people stood up against the Roman emperor and said, we are not going to keep Sunday. And that happened in the 16th century. And that's what led all the people to start migrating out of Europe and going into America. Because we become a wilderness, we become a new place of safety for those people. And so that's the story that nobody has told you. So you actually lost, you had actually somewhere between 5 and 8 million people gave up their life and come out of the Catholic Church. I mean, I just think it's the most amazing history, and most people don't know it. And that's why, y'all wanted me to come share it with you so that you can see what actually took place. Because, see, we in this country are so blessed because the founders in this country were religious men. And they kept saying, John Adams kept saying, well, I don't think we put enough Torah in the Constitution. So they were all keeping, many of them were keeping, like John Adams was a Saturday Sabbath keeper. People don't know that. He was one of your presidents. And so it's interesting because we don't even know that history. We don't even know that they were keeping the Saturday Sabbath, but they were. Many of them were. And by the way, Benjamin Franklin kept the Saturday Sabbath. Most people don't know that either. But he was really good friends with some of the people that would come in right before the American Revolution. So, I mean, I can get into all that history, but it's for the American history. It's just a fascinating stuff. It's just fascinating stuff to me. But we've been so spoiled in this country because we have religious freedom. Well, the reason we have religious freedom and the reason we have a Bill of Rights is because when the people that were the Saturday Sabbath keepers, they came into the state of Rhode Island. And Rhode Island was the haven for all the Saturday Sabbath keepers. And when the Constitution was being signed by every one of the states, Rhode Island held out. They said, we are not going to do it until you put a provision in this that says we have freedom of religion, because we're not going to have the Anglican Church tell us how we're going to keep the Sabbath and when we're going to keep. So they held their line in the sand. Most people don't realize that. And then what happened then is that's when George Washington, Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin and some of the others sat down and began to write the Bill of Rights. And they put in the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, and they added it in. That's why it's a separate bill into part of the Constitution. And so our country has always had freedom of religion. And so we have no idea what other people have gone to in the past because they didn't have it. So I just wanted to share that story with y'all. There's more to it. I can't cover everything, but it's more to it.
For more information about this broadcast, please visit our website at www.12tribehistory.com. That is the number 12, tribehistory.com, or email us at lwatson44@cox.net with any questions or comments.